I didn't end up here by accident. That's the part that hurts the most. Every major piece of my life was built intentionally. Step by step. Choice by choice. Nothing was forced. Nothing was stolen from me. I wasn't trapped by circumstances or pushed into a corner. I agreed. And now I live inside the consequences of those agreements. When people talk about regret, they often imagine chaos, reckless decisions, obvious mistakes, dramatic turning points. My regret came from doing everything right. I followed the reasonable path. I chose what made sense. I picked the options that sounded stable, respectable, responsible. Each decision looked harmless on its own. Sensible, even. But stacked together, they built a life I never wanted to wake up inside. At the time, I didn't know that's what I was doing. I thought I was being smart. I listened to advice. I watched others. I paid attention to what was rewarded and what was dismissed. I learned which dreams were called unrealistic and which ones earned approval. So I adjusted. I didn't abandon myself all at once. I negotiated. I compromised. I delayed. I told myself I could always circle back later and make space for what I actually wanted. Later became permanent. Each choice felt small. Manageable. Temporary. I didn't choose this life in one dramatic moment. I assembled it slowly, like furniture from instructions I never questioned. I trusted the process. I believed that if I followed the steps correctly, satisfaction would eventually arrive. It didn't. It's strange to realize that you can succeed at building a life and still feel like a stranger inside it. I had structure. Routine. Predictability. On paper, everything aligned. Inside, I felt miscast. I remember the first time the thought surfaced clearly. I was sitting alone in my apartment, quiet, clean, carefully maintained, and I had the sudden, disorienting realization that nothing in that space reflected who I was. Not my tastes. Not my values. Not my inner life. It looked like someone else's home. Someone more practical. More ambitious. More committed to outcomes than meaning. I brushed the feeling away. Everyone feels disconnected sometimes. Adulthood is about responsibility. You don't build a life around feelings. That's what I told myself. So I kept going. I made choices that impressed people. That made sense in conversations. That didn't require explanation. I learned how to speak about my life confidently even when I felt hollow describing it. People assumed I was content. I didn't correct them. I told myself fulfillment would catch up. That desire would adjust. That this was simply the cost of stability. But stability without alignment is not peace. It's endurance. I began to notice how often I described my life using neutral language. Not good. Not bad. Just, fine. Manageable. Acceptable. Those words should have alarmed me. They didn't. Because nothing was obviously wrong. That's what made it so dangerous. I wasn't unhappy in a way that demanded escape. I wasn't desperate enough to leave. I wasn't miserable enough to justify disruption. I was simply living a life that required constant self-suppression to maintain. I stopped asking myself certain questions because I didn't like the answers. What do you actually want? Who would you be if no one was watching? If you could start over, would you choose this again? Those questions threatened the structure I had built. So I avoided them. I focused on execution instead. On maintenance. On keeping things running smoothly. I told myself that wanting something different was immature. That gratitude meant acceptance. But gratitude used as a weapon against yourself becomes a prison. I started feeling it in my body before I could articulate it in words. A heaviness when waking up. A dull resistance to my own routine. A sense of dragging myself through days that looked successful from the outside. I didn't hate my life. I just wasn't in it. I had become the manager of my own existence, efficient, reliable, emotionally distant. And the most unsettling part was this: no one else had designed this life for me. I had. Every time I chose the safer option. Every time I prioritized approval over alignment. Every time I told myself this is good enough. I built something functional. I didn't build something true. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with grief. Grief for the person I could have been if I had allowed myself to want more loudly. Grief for the paths I dismissed because they didn't look impressive enough. Grief for the years I spent building instead of listening. I understood then that regret isn't always about what you did wrong. Sometimes it's about what you did efficiently, consistently, and without yourself in mind. I had constructed a life with care, discipline, and intention. Just not my own. And once that truth settled in, I couldn't ignore the question that followed: if I built this life, can I dismantle it without destroying myself? Once I admitted to myself that I had built a life I never wanted, I expected clarity to follow. A plan. A direction. Some obvious next step. Instead, I felt paralyzed. Because dismantling something you built carefully is harder than escaping something that was forced on you. There's no villain to blame. No external pressure to push against. Just your own reflection asking why you agreed to this for so long. I began to see how deeply invested I was in maintaining the structure of my life. Not because it made me happy, but because it worked. It paid the bills. It looked respectable. It gave people a clear way to understand who I was. And understanding, I learned, is comforting. I didn't want to confuse anyone. I didn't want to disrupt expectations. I didn't want to admit that the version of myself people recognized wasn't the one living inside. So I stayed. I told myself it wasn't that bad. That everyone feels disconnected sometimes, that wanting something different didn't mean something was wrong. But those thoughts started to feel thin. I noticed how often I minimized my own dissatisfaction. How quickly I silenced internal resistance with logic. How reflexively I chose continuity over curiosity. I wasn't trapped. I was loyal to a construction that no longer fit. That loyalty had a cost. I felt it in the way I avoided imagining alternatives. In how uncomfortable I became when people talked about radical changes or second chances. Their stories didn't inspire me, they unsettled me. Because they implied that reinvention was possible. And possibility threatened the entire logic of my life. If I could choose differently now, then what did that say about all the years I had already invested? That question terrified me. I had built my identity around coherence. Around making decisions that connected logically to each other. Around continuity. The idea of stepping off that path felt like admitting failure, not just of circumstance, but of judgment. I had been so careful. So intentional. So reasonable. How could that lead to emptiness? I began to realize that reason had been my shield. A way to justify choices that avoided discomfort. A way to translate fear into wisdom. I chose what was practical instead of what was meaningful. What was applauded instead of what was honest. What was predictable instead of what was alive. None of those choices were wrong individually. Together, they erased me. I noticed how exhausted I was, not physically, but existentially. Every day required me to perform alignment with a life I felt increasingly detached from. I spoke about goals I no longer believed in. I upheld routines that felt hollow. I protected an image that no longer represented me. That kind of maintenance is draining. I started to fantasize about collapse, not because I wanted disaster, but because collapse would give me permission to stop. To change without explanation. To leave without justifying why. That thought scared me. It meant I was waiting for something to break so I wouldn't have to break it myself. I saw then how deeply avoidance still shaped me. I wasn't afraid of change. I was afraid of responsibility for change. Responsibility means owning both the past and the future. It means accepting that I built this life and that continuing to live in it was also my choice. That realization was heavy. Because it meant I couldn't escape by calling myself a victim of circumstance. I had to face the fact that I had participated willingly, even eagerly, in my own misalignment. I began to grieve the time I had lost, not dramatically, but quietly. I felt sorrow for the years spent optimizing for everything except myself. For the moments when I ignored inner signals because they were inconvenient. That grief didn't demand action immediately. It asked a different question. If you stop building the life others expect, who are you underneath it? I didn't know, and that uncertainty was terrifying. I realized that the life I had built wasn't just something I lived in, it was something I hid behind. It gave me structure so I didn't have to confront the ambiguity of who I was without it. Letting go of it meant standing in that ambiguity without armor. I began to understand why people stay in lives they've outgrown. Not because they don't see the truth, but because the truth demands an identity reconstruction, not just a change of plans. And reconstruction takes courage. Not the loud kind. The kind that lets you disappoint people. The kind that tolerates confusion. The kind that allows you to be temporarily undefined. I wasn't there yet. But something had shifted. I could no longer pretend that my discomfort was temporary or meaningless. I could no longer tell myself that fulfillment would arrive later as a reward for patience. I saw clearly that patience had already cost me years. And the question that remained wasn't whether I had built the wrong life. It was whether I was willing to dismantle it slowly before it finished dismantling me. Dismantling the life I built didn't begin with destruction. It began with disobedience. Not dramatic rebellion. Not burning bridges or making announcements. Just small refusals to continue performing a version of myself that no longer existed inside. The first thing I dismantled was language. I stopped saying this is fine when it wasn't. I stopped saying it makes sense when it felt wrong. I stopped narrating my life as if logic alone could justify living it. That was harder than it sounds. Because language shapes reality. And my words had been reinforcing a structure I was trying to leave. Every time I described my life confidently, I convinced both myself and others that it was aligned even when it wasn't. Changing how I spoke exposed cracks I had carefully sealed. People noticed. They asked questions I wasn't ready to answer cleanly. They sensed hesitation where certainty used to be. Some grew uncomfortable. Others became curious. A few pulled away, unsure how to interact with someone who no longer fit the role they understood. That loss hurt. But it hurt honestly. For the first time, my discomfort wasn't coming from suppression. It was coming from movement. I began dismantling my routines next. Not by abandoning responsibility, but by questioning necessity. I asked myself why I did certain things, not whether they were efficient, but whether they were mine. Some habits fell away quietly. Others resisted. Some parts of my life were clearly scaffolding for an identity I no longer inhabited. Letting them go felt destabilizing. There were days when I missed the certainty of my old life, the clarity, the predictability, the sense of forward motion even when it was hollow. Dismantling created gaps. Silence. Unanswered questions. I had to sit with not knowing who I was becoming. That was the hardest part. I realized how much of my self-worth had been tied to progress, visible, explainable progress. Without it, I felt exposed. Unimpressive. Undefined. But something else was happening underneath the discomfort. I was listening. Not to expectations. Not to plans. Not to narratives about what a good life should look like. To myself. At first, that voice was faint. Rusted from disuse. It didn't offer grand visions or clear directions. It spoke in preferences, not plans. In aversions. In quiet relief when I didn't force myself into something that felt wrong. I learned to respect that. I stopped asking, will this lead somewhere? I started asking, does this require me to disappear? That question became my compass. Some choices I made looked irrational from the outside. They didn't optimize status. They didn't impress. They didn't connect neatly to the life I had built. But they felt honest. And honesty, I learned, has its own kind of coherence. Not immediate. Not visible. But cumulative. Over time, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Engagement. Not excitement. Not certainty. Engagement. The sense that my actions were connected to my inner life again. That when I moved, it was me moving, not a system carrying me forward. The regret didn't disappear. I still mourn the years I spent building something I didn't want. The energy invested. The versions of myself that never got space to exist. That grief is real and permanent. But it no longer defines me. Because regret rooted in awareness can become instruction instead of punishment. I learned that building a life isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process, and you're allowed to revise the blueprint. Even late. Even imperfectly. Even after you've invested more than you want to admit. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself successful, functional, respected, and quietly absent, I want you to hear this clearly: you are not ungrateful for wanting something else. You are not broken for feeling misaligned. And you are not obligated to finish building a life you started under different assumptions. I built a life I never wanted. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't listen. Dismantling it didn't make everything easier. It didn't give me a clean replacement or a new identity overnight. What it gave me was authorship. The ability to choose again. To build slower. To build smaller. To build something that reflects who I am now, not who I was trying to become to be accepted. My life today is less impressive on paper. But when I wake up inside it, I recognize myself. And after all the years of construction without consent, that recognition feels like the truest form of success I've ever known. That is how I began again. Not by starting over completely. But by finally building with myself in mind.